The cell sits in near total darkness, a block of concrete and steel inside the most secure unit of Barwon Prison. The air is still. The lights are fixed to a dim setting that never fully lifts the shadows pressed against the walls. In the center of the room, a man remains restrained, his wrists marked from the cuffs that keep him in place. On paper, he is an inmate serving time for murder. In practice, the reality is far less contained. Despite the layers of security wrapped around him, the reach of his influence stretches well beyond this 6-square-metre space, travelling into suburbs and industrial zones across Victoria. It is a contradiction so stark that even experienced officers have struggled to explain it. Outside the cell, at a desk lined with worn folders and electronic evidence logs, investigators review a briefing that has grown heavier by the week. They turn each page slowly, almost carefully, as if the information inside carries weight beyond its physical form. There are photographs of green tea cartons seized from shipping depots, lists of industrial components packaged as legitimate imports but flagged in intelligence reports, screenshots of phone call transcripts, most of them laced with coded phrases whose meaning is still being pieced together. Each element has its own origin story, yet all of them trace back to the same unlikely source: a maximum security cell occupied by a man who should have been cut off from the outside world. On another table sit maps of international freight routes. Lines run from Malaysia to Melbourne. Others travel from Thailand to the same destination. On the surface, they represent normal trade movement, the kind that passes through the state every day. But the figures attached to these particular shipments do not match the pattern. Quantities rise unexpectedly. Consignments appear under shell companies with no meaningful history. Payment trails split and rejoin, forming patterns that analysts describe as deliberate rather than incidental. It raises a question that becomes harder to ignore. How does a single inmate, stripped of autonomy and confined behind multiple locked gates, manage to orchestrate transactions of this scale? Detectives do not voice their frustration openly, but the tension is visible in the way they sift through the files. Every discovery seems to pull them deeper into something that should not exist. The working theory is unsettling. Someone from the inside is directing operations outside, issuing instructions with a level of confidence that suggests more than momentary opportunity. The evidence is not yet complete, yet the direction of the inquiry is unmistakable. Somewhere between the restraints of the cell and the freedom of the streets, a gap has formed, one large enough for an organized network to move through it. Questions begin to layer on top of each other. Is the problem rooted in a failure of procedure, a moment where security slipped just enough for communication to escape the prison walls? Or is it connected to the inmate himself, a person whose ability to influence others might have been underestimated? Officers note that none of the signs fit neatly into a single explanation. The coded instructions carried the tone of someone accustomed to authority, not desperation. The shipments, despite their cover as everyday freight, displayed planning that required patience rather than impulse. It implies intent, structure, and a capacity to coordinate at distance. There is an unease that grows as the scope becomes clearer. A maximum security prison is designed to contain danger, to place a definitive barrier between an offender and the community. It is built on the idea that confinement brings an end to harm. Yet, in these documents, the harm does not appear to have ended. It appears to have evolved. Instead of ceasing, it has taken another shape, one more complex, more dispersed, and far harder to intercept. For some officers, this is the detail that lingers the longest. The system meant to restrict activity seems to have unknowingly provided the perfect cover for it. In meetings, the senior investigators choose their language carefully. They avoid speculation, focusing only on what can be substantiated. They speak about anomalies, inconsistencies, and patterns that warrant further inquiry. Still, beneath the professional tone sits a growing awareness that the case may reveal something larger. If one inmate can manipulate supply chains from behind reinforced doors, what does that imply about the structural blind spots that allowed such communication to move freely? The question is not just about the offender, but about the environment around him. Even before the full picture forms, the sense of imbalance hangs in the air. It challenges the assumption that the worst danger exists outside prison walls. Here, the line feels reversed. The presence of heavy restraints contrasts with the reach of the activity attributed to the man inside them. Officers look again at the reports, noting the steady rise in intercepted shipments, the broadening web of contacts, and the repeated overlap with specific criminal groups operating in Melbourne's northern suburbs. None of this should be possible under maximum security, yet the evidence points toward a coordinated effort that continued for months. By the time the briefing ends, no one in the room speaks for a moment. The silence is not dramatic. It is the type that follows recognition. Something significant has been moving beneath the surface. It is not yet fully understood, but its outline is unmistakable. The files do not answer every question, but they provide enough to establish a simple, confronting truth. This story does not begin where most prison stories end. To understand how a convicted inmate could build influence from inside a locked cell, and how that influence grew into something that touched multiple borders and supply lines, we have to step back from the present. The path that led here did not form overnight. It has roots, deep ones, and the only way to make sense of the present is to go back to where those roots first appeared. Before we unravel the network that emerged behind the walls of Barwon, we need to return to the beginning. To understand how a man could one day manipulate criminal networks from within a maximum security cell, we have to return to the life that shaped him long before prison walls came into view. George Marrogi was born into a family that had migrated from the Middle East to Victoria, joining a community that had spent years trying to find stability. In a country that offered opportunity, but also delivered its own challenges. Many families who arrived during that period were navigating language barriers, financial pressure, and cultural adjustment all at once. In those circumstances, children often carried more weight than they were ready for, absorbing tensions they had little control over. Marrogi grew up in such an environment, where the expectations of settlement clashed with the realities faced by migrant households trying to establish themselves in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. The neighbourhoods where he spent his early years were shaped by rapid population growth and uneven infrastructure. Families crowded into rental properties. Schools were under-resourced. Youth centres lacked funding. Community groups did their best to keep up, but the pace of social change outstripped the support available. In these pockets of the suburbs, young people often slipped through gaps in the system without anyone intending for it to happen. If a child became restless or disengaged, the signs were easy to miss. Teachers and parents were already stretched thin, dealing with issues that extended far beyond a single household. Marrogi's childhood reflected this broader environment. Those who knew him in his early years described a boy who was spirited but inconsistent, someone who reacted quickly to tension and struggled to settle into routine. At home, financial strain and cultural expectations sometimes led to conflict. Nothing that set off alarms on its own, but enough to create a backdrop where structure was fragile. Without steady guidance, he often made decisions impulsively, responding more to immediate emotion than long-term consequences. This pattern wasn't unusual for young people in the area, but in his case, the lack of consistent intervention meant it continued unchecked. School life mirrored the instability of his home environment. The schools he attended were in districts classified as low-performing, places where staff turnover was high and resources were often stretched. Teachers tried to maintain order, but students regularly dealt with challenges that reached far beyond classroom walls. It wasn't uncommon for teenagers to drift into groups that formed loosely around shared frustrations, boredom, or the search for belonging. For some, these groups remained harmless. For others, they grew into the early stages of street crews, then later into something more organized. As a child, Marrogi did not stand out as someone destined for serious criminal behavior. He was not the most disruptive, nor the most withdrawn. His tendencies leaned towards impulsiveness and occasional defiance, but these traits alone did not set him apart from many of his peers. What did distinguish him, though quietly, was how susceptible he was to external influence. He gravitated toward older youths who provided the sort of certainty he lacked at home. Their confidence appealed to him, and he began modeling his behavior on theirs. Little by little, he adopted their attitudes, their way of handling disputes, and their growing mistrust of authority. This shift did not happen in a single moment. Rather, it developed gradually, shaped by the environment surrounding him. During the time he was growing up, Melbourne was experiencing an increase in youth involvement in street-based groups. Most did not evolve into full-scale gangs, but they normalized certain levels of aggression, loyalty, and boundary pushing. Without structured support networks or mentors to redirect him, Marrogi became increasingly comfortable within these circles. What seemed at first like casual friendships slowly evolved into connections that held more influence than anything available elsewhere in his life. The lack of early intervention played a significant role. Teachers who noticed concerns had limited capacity to follow through. Community workers only interacted with families sporadically. There were no targeted programs strong enough to catch children whose behavior was beginning to drift. The systems in place were designed to respond to clear-cut cases, not subtler ones like this. As a result, Marrogi remained largely unnoticed, moving through school years without receiving the sort of guidance that might have redirected him. From the outside, everything appeared manageable. Inside, though, patterns were forming that would shape his decisions in adolescence. As he entered his teenage years, the sense of instability deepened. The lines between normal adolescent testing of boundaries and more concerning behavior became increasingly blurred. Minor confrontations escalated more quickly. Friendships relied heavily on hierarchy and displays of toughness. These dynamics, while common in certain neighborhoods, had a stronger impact on someone like Marrogi, whose sense of identity was still unsettled. The more he identified with peers who valued dominance and defiance, the more those qualities became embedded in his own behavior. Despite these emerging signs, nothing at this stage pointed conclusively towards the path he would later take. There were no high-profile incidents, no early charges that made headlines. Instead, there was a steady drift, made up of small choices, overlooked warnings, and an environment that lacked the capacity to intervene effectively. When tension surfaced at home, he often turned outward, relying on peers whose influence would gradually steer him away from conventional expectations and closer to subcultures that normalized risk. By the time he approached late adolescence, the gap between him and a stable path had widened. He moved through school with only minimal engagement. Opportunities that might have anchored him, such as vocational programs or community-led initiatives, were either unavailable or not offered to him at the right time. The sense of belonging he found within emerging street groups outweighed anything school or home could provide. These connections offered certainty, even if they carried darker potential underneath. Looking back at these early years, what stands out is not a single defining event, but a combination of pressures, absences, and influences that accumulated over time. Nothing about his upbringing was extraordinary in isolation. Thousands of young people grew up in similar conditions without moving into organized criminal behavior. What made his trajectory different was the combination of vulnerability, environment, and timing. Had even one support structure been stronger, the direction of his life might have shifted. But the systems around him were stretched, and the support he needed did not arrive. As a result, he entered adulthood carrying unresolved tension, a developing resistance to authority, and a reliance on peer groups that prioritized strength and dominance. These elements would later form the foundation for choices that placed him on a collision course with the criminal landscape of Victoria. But at this point in his life, it was still possible to look at him and see only a young man shaped by difficult circumstances, not someone who would one day exert influence that reached deep into the state's underworld. If observed briefly, his early life appeared unremarkable, even ordinary in many ways. Yet, beneath that surface lay the conditions that allowed more dangerous patterns to take hold. It is this blend of normality and quiet instability that makes his early years significant. Without understanding this foundation, the events that follow would seem disconnected. With it, the path ahead becomes clearer, though still unsettling in how easily it formed. By the time his teenage years came to an end, the course of his life had already begun to set. The behaviors, influences, and unresolved struggles of childhood had created a momentum difficult to reverse. It is from here, on the edge of adulthood, that the next phase begins. As George Marrogi moved from adolescence into early adulthood, the unsettled foundations of his childhood began to shape the decisions he made with increasing clarity. The shift was not sudden. It developed in increments, often unnoticed by the people around him, and rarely addressed with the level of seriousness it required. His teenage years had already shown signs of instability, but in the transition to young adulthood, those signs started to harden into patterns. What had once been impulsive reactions evolved into deliberate choices. He drifted further from school during this time, attending irregularly and engaging even less when he did. Without the structure of education or stable routines at home, he gravitated toward the only constant available to him, a network of street-based peers who provided a sense of belonging. These groups were not formally organized, but they operated with their own hierarchy and norms. Membership offered him both companionship and influence, something he had lacked elsewhere. As he spent more time within these circles, he absorbed their values, particularly the belief that strength was best shown through confrontation. The first incidents that marked his slide into more serious behavior were relatively minor in isolation. Fights outside takeaway shops, arguments that escalated into threats, instances of intimidating behavior directed at peers or strangers. Police attended some of these situations, but often resolved them with verbal warnings. Officers saw a teenager acting out, not someone on the verge of entering the orbit of organized crime. Teachers, already overwhelmed by larger issues within the school system, noted the behavior, but did not have the means to intervene effectively. At home, the fractures that had appeared in his childhood had not healed, leaving little guidance available when he needed it most. These early warnings passed without major consequence, which in turn reinforced his belief that he could act without significant accountability. He learned that certain behaviors drew attention, but rarely led to serious outcomes. This lesson proved damaging, not because it encouraged immediate criminality, but because it removed the natural boundaries that might have slowed his progression. The absence of early intervention created a space where more concerning influences could take hold. During this period, he began associating with older figures who operated closer to the fringes of local criminal groups. They were not major players, but they understood the street economy well enough to recognize potential in young men who displayed loyalty and confidence. To them, Marrogi's impulsiveness was not a flaw. It was an asset. He was willing to act, quick to respond when challenged, and eager to demonstrate his commitment to the group. These qualities drew them to him, and he responded in turn by adopting their expectations as his own. He moved from being a peripheral figure to someone relied upon to help resolve disputes. These disputes seldom involved formal negotiations. Instead, they were handled through displays of force or intimidation designed to maintain control within a small circle of influence. This role provided him with a sense of significance he had not experienced before. It also exposed him to environments where violence was not just accepted, but occasionally encouraged. Each incident blurred the line between youthful conflict and criminal conduct. As his involvement deepened, the behaviors he engaged in grew more calculated. He stopped acting out simply because of frustration or emotion. Instead, he reacted to the needs of the group, positioning himself as someone who could be counted on when tensions escalated. He learned how to apply pressure without attracting immediate police attention. He also began to observe how older individuals managed their operations, taking note of who they trusted, how they avoided scrutiny, and which methods they used to maintain order within their ranks. Around this time, access to illicit substances became more common within the groups he frequented. What started as exposure to recreational drugs quickly shifted into contact with individuals who handled supply rather than consumption. These connections opened a new world to him, one that operated on a very different scale from the street-level disputes he had previously been involved in. The trade routes, coded communication, and hidden financial flows associated with drug importation intrigued him. He saw structure rather than chaos, and for the first time he encountered a criminal environment built on planning rather than impulse. His curiosity did not go unnoticed. Those already involved in the trade recognized in him someone who could be shaped. He began running small errands, mostly menial at first, collecting payments or delivering messages. But these tasks allowed him to observe the broader system. He learned how shipments entered the state, how they were concealed within legitimate imports, and how each participant played a specific role in keeping operations discreet. He also saw how disputes within this environment were handled more severely than those in street-level groups, reinforcing the importance of loyalty and caution. As he absorbed this knowledge, he began forming his own smaller group of associates. These were young men from the same communities he had grown up in, some sharing similar backgrounds and uncertainties. With them, he practiced the organizational skills he had begun to learn. He delegated responsibilities, coordinated minor activities, and resolved internal disagreements. This period marked a turning point. He was no longer simply following others. He was beginning to lead. His behavior still carried the rough edges of youth, but it was increasingly supported by an emerging sense of strategy. The danger at this stage was not obvious to those around him. Family members saw a young man spending time with friends. Police viewed him as another figure within the broader tapestry of youth groups. Teachers and community workers encountered hundreds of young people with similar traits and could not identify which ones were drifting towards organized criminal activity. The signs were present, but they were subtle, spread across different domains of his life, and never concentrated enough to trigger meaningful intervention. Meanwhile, within the circles he operated in, he was solidifying his reputation. He became known as someone who could be relied upon when situations required firmness, and his growing confidence encouraged others to follow him. He managed to balance visibility within his peer group with a level of discretion that avoided drawing significant law enforcement attention. This combination made him valuable to older operators who preferred not to expose themselves directly. As months turned into years, his involvement in more serious matters increased. He met individuals connected to international supply chains, people who understood the logistics of moving drugs into Australia from overseas. His role within these interactions was still limited, but the exposure shaped his understanding of how structured and profitable these enterprises could be. He began to appreciate the scale of operations that extended beyond local turf disputes, and the possibility of moving into larger, more organized networks became increasingly appealing. Throughout this time, the people closest to him remained largely unaware of the extent of his involvement. From the outside, his behavior appeared typical of many young men in the area who drifted between jobs, friendships, and street-level conflicts. But beneath that outward appearance was a trajectory that was steadily narrowing. Each decision he made during these years reduced the number of paths available to him, reinforcing commitments that would become difficult to break later. The final shift towards more serious conflict came when he crossed paths with an individual who would later become central to a major turning point in his life, a man named Kadir Ors. Their relationship began with tension rooted in the drug trade, a domain where disputes could escalate quickly and with lasting consequence. This conflict did not erupt immediately, but it marked the moment when his involvement in criminal life reached a level where violence carried weight beyond intimidation. It signaled the beginning of a chapter where the stakes would rise sharply. In retrospect, this period represents the point where intervention would have been the most effective yet was least likely. The warning signs were present, but they were dispersed, visible only when viewed collectively, not individually. Without that broader perspective, those around him saw episodes rather than a pattern. It is this pattern, now clearly formed, that leads directly into the moment when tensions with Ors would set him on a path from which there would be no simple return. The conflict between George Marrogi and Kadir Ors had been building for some time, shaped by tensions within the drug trade that neither man attempted to hide. By early 2016, those tensions had escalated beyond negotiation. On a day that would later become central to his criminal history, the confrontation reached its peak at Campbellfield Plaza, a busy retail strip in Melbourne's north. The encounter was brief, unfolding in a matter of moments, but its consequences were profound. Witnesses described hearing raised voices before a shot rang out, leaving Ors fatally injured. The act was deliberate, and it signaled a point of no return. Police responded quickly, cordoning off the area as forensic officers worked to document the scene. Investigators identified Marrogi as the primary suspect within hours, drawing on witness accounts, surveillance footage, and prior intelligence linking the two men to ongoing disputes. The arrest that followed was swift. Once in custody, he maintained a controlled demeanor, offering little insight into the events that had taken place. The case proceeded through the courts without delay, supported by a combination of direct evidence and contextual information that established motive and opportunity. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to a lengthy term, eventually transferred to Barwon Prison, one of Victoria's highest security facilities. For many observing the case, this conviction appeared to be the end point. The expectation was that incarceration would sever his ties to the criminal networks he had been involved with. Barwon's security protocols were designed precisely for this purpose. It was a place where communication was limited and heavily monitored, where high-risk inmates were held under strict conditions to prevent further harm. Yet, within months of his arrival, it became clear that the story was not closing. Instead, it was shifting into a form that authorities had not anticipated. Rather than retreating under the weight of the sentence, Marrogi began to reassert himself from within the prison. The isolation that might have subdued another offender seemed to provide him with focus. He observed the rhythms of the unit, learned its limitations, and identified the gaps that could be used to his advantage. He did not rely on force here. Instead, he relied on organization. Slowly, he reconnected with individuals on the outside, using what limited access he had to the prison phone system. The conversations were coded, structured to avoid detection, but they carried instructions that formed the early framework for a new network. These communications alone would not have been enough without someone on the outside willing to interpret and execute his directives. That role was taken on by Antonietta Manella, Sorolomwe, a woman who became central to the operation. Their relationship predated his incarceration, but it deepened during this period. Through her, he gained a conduit to the world beyond Barwon's walls. She handled tasks that he could not perform directly, establishing contacts, negotiating supply arrangements, and coordinating the movement of goods. Her involvement allowed his influence to extend across borders and through supply chains that spanned multiple countries. It was during this time that shipments containing illicit substances began arriving in Victoria with increasing frequency. The drugs were concealed within everyday products that blended easily into commercial freight, green tea packaging, industrial magnets, and trolley components. These concealment methods were effective partly because they resembled legitimate imports. The consignments moved through ports and warehouses without drawing immediate suspicion, benefiting from the sheer scale of goods passing through the state. Intelligence analysts later noted that each shipment had been planned with considerable care, suggesting a level of oversight inconsistent with someone operating from a cell. As the quantities grew, so did the financial stakes. The value of these shipments ran into the tens of millions, a scale that demanded precision rather than chance. Yet the coordination appeared seamless. Payments were routed through intermediaries. Pickups were arranged through coded instructions. Distribution was managed through networks that had been operating at a smaller scale before his imprisonment, but expanded significantly under his direction. These operations provided resources and influence to those connected to him, reinforcing his status despite the physical restrictions placed upon him. Police became aware of the irregularities surrounding these shipments, but lacked the information needed to pinpoint their origin. Investigators noted patterns in freight activity that suggested coordinated importation, but the individuals handling each stage were compartmentalized, minimizing the risk of the entire network being exposed. Every time authorities moved closer to understanding a particular shipment, the trail would shift, leaving only fragments that hinted at a larger structure beneath the surface. The absence of a clear leader made the operation difficult to map. Officers involved in the investigation expressed concern at the growing sophistication of the activities. The scale of the shipments, combined with the consistency of their arrival, suggested more than opportunistic smuggling. Yet identifying the person orchestrating the operation remained challenging. Without direct evidence linking communications to specific acts, the gaps between suspicion and confirmation could not be bridged. Manella continued to operate discreetly, maintaining her position as the external coordinator, while Marrogi's role remained hidden behind layers of coded language and intermediaries who communicated with strict caution. The frequency of the shipments eventually raised red flags across multiple agencies. Each consignment carried its own anomalies, unusual routing, inconsistent documentation, or financial irregularities. These anomalies were not overt enough to trigger immediate action, but collectively signaled that something significant was unfolding. Analysts began mapping the connections, using small pieces of information to build a broader picture. Even so, the central figure remained obscured. The idea that an inmate might be directing operations of this magnitude from within Barwon seemed implausible, leading some investigators to look elsewhere for the mastermind. Meanwhile, within the prison, Marrogi continued to refine his approach. He relied on indirect communication, carefully structured messages, and an understanding of how surveillance within the prison operated. He avoided unnecessary contact, choosing instead to maintain a low profile that allowed him to continue functioning without drawing attention. This strategy worked for an extended period, enabling him to maintain influence while shielding himself from immediate detection. His position was strengthened further by the loyalty of those who benefited from his leadership, both inside and outside the prison. The secrecy surrounding the operation created frustration among law enforcement officials. Each intercepted shipment added urgency to the investigation, yet, without a clear link to the individual responsible, enforcement efforts were limited. The structure of the network ensured that frontline participants could only provide partial information. Many knew their immediate tasks, but not the overall hierarchy. This compartmentalization was effective, allowing the network to function even when certain elements were identified or disrupted. As the months passed, the scale of the importations grew harder to overlook. The cumulative value of the shipments represented a significant threat, prompting agencies to intensify their efforts. Joint operations were established to cross-reference data, investigate financial transactions, and examine communication patterns. Yet, despite this renewed focus, the question at the center of the investigation remained unanswered. By this point, it was clear that someone was directing an increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprise. The coordination, timing, and precision of the activities all pointed toward a single guiding hand. But the identity of that hand remained concealed behind layers of distance, coded communication, and deliberate misdirection. The weight of this uncertainty built steadily. It left investigators with a question that grew more pressing with each shipment intercepted or observed. Who was managing this network, and how was that person able to operate undetected? The question did not yet have an answer, but the search for one had begun to narrow. It would not be long before investigators realized that the direction they had overlooked was the one they needed to follow. The investigation into the expanding drug network began quietly, long before investigators realized how far its influence reached. As consignments continued arriving in Victoria with concerning irregularities, the Australian Federal Police formed a joint operation with Victoria Police to examine the pattern. The collaboration was built on necessity rather than assumption. Officers did not yet know the full scope of what they were dealing with, only that each shipment carried indicators of deliberate coordination. Their task was to isolate the threads and determine whether they belonged to a single source or multiple independent operators. Initial inquiries focused on freight routes from Malaysia and Thailand, two countries that commonly appeared in importation cases. These routes were not suspicious on their own, but analysts noticed subtle deviations in shipping schedules and documentation. Certain consignments arrived ahead of expected timelines, while others passed through logistics companies that appeared relatively new or lacked a clear business background. None of these anomalies, viewed individually, were enough to justify a large-scale operation. But collectively, they formed a cluster of red flags that required further scrutiny. To pursue these leads, officers conducted a series of small, targeted raids across Melbourne's northern and western suburbs. The aim was to identify the individuals handling the goods once they entered the state. These operations resulted in multiple arrests, but each time the individuals detained were low-tier handlers. They could describe their tasks, the locations they were directed to, and the instructions they received, but none could identify the person giving the orders. Many claimed they only communicated with a single intermediary and had no visibility beyond that. These limitations frustrated investigators, who repeatedly found themselves standing at the edge of the network without gaining access to its core. Complicating matters further was the sense that someone within the operation was anticipating enforcement activity. Plans that had been developed carefully appeared to lose traction at the last moment. Raids missed their targets by hours. Deliveries were rerouted unexpectedly. At times, information that seemed solid during surveillance dissipated without explanation. Officers began questioning whether the network was receiving advance warning. There was no evidence of a leak, but the timing of these disruptions created an impression that the operation was always one step ahead. Each attempt to intercept a critical shipment delivered the same outcome: partial answers and diminished momentum. The only consistent feature across these encounters was the freight itself. Packages of green tea, crates of industrial magnets, trolley components. Each category of goods could be explained legitimately, and the concealment methods were subtle enough that they blended into the broader marketplace. Even when officers located drugs hidden inside these items, the remainder of the supply chain remained opaque. They could see the products. They could document their movement. But the architect remained invisible. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation expanded. Analysts reviewed hours of surveillance footage, compared financial transactions across multiple states, and re-examined statements from those arrested. Still, the network's leadership remained unidentified. Without a clear figure to target, the operation risked losing direction. The scale of the shipments meant that continued inaction carried significant risk. Yet, pursuing the wrong line of inquiry could compromise the entire case. Investigators were caught between the urgency of stopping the flow and the need to build evidence carefully. The turning point came from an unexpected place. During a routine audit of recorded prison communications, part of a broader intelligence review, a corrections officer flagged a phone call from Barwon Prison that contained unusual phrasing. The content of the call was outwardly mundane, referencing everyday matters, but the rhythm of the conversation and certain repeated phrases matched patterns detected in the coded instructions used in the freight investigation. The officer forwarded the recording to the Joint Task Force, uncertain of its significance. When investigators listened to it, the effect was immediate. The cadence, the pauses, and the assertive tone were strikingly similar to descriptions gathered from arrested intermediaries. This discovery prompted a deeper review of communications from Barwon. Analysts isolated specific segments of calls that appeared to diverge from ordinary conversation. They compared these segments with fragments of intercepted instructions from the drug network. The alignment was not yet definitive, but it was strong enough to justify further examination. As more recordings were reviewed, a consistent voice emerged, one issuing guidance in a controlled, directive manner, using coded language similar to that found in external operations. It was at this stage that investigators began to consider the possibility they had previously dismissed, that the person coordinating the network might be operating from within a maximum security prison. Files were pulled, inmate lists cross-referenced, and voice profiles analysed. The name that surfaced repeatedly belonged to George Marrogi. Although he had been incarcerated since his murder conviction, he had maintained contact with individuals outside the prison in ways that now required closer scrutiny. The realization brought a mixture of progress and uncertainty. If the voice belonged to him, the investigation would shift dramatically. But confirmation was necessary before taking any overt action. To avoid alerting the network, investigators proceeded cautiously. They requested access to additional recordings, reviewed visitor logs, and examined the timing of shipments in relation to calls made from Barwon. The patterns that emerged were too consistent to ignore. Instructions given during certain calls aligned almost precisely with the preparation and arrival of specific consignments. Although the coded language remained ambiguous, the sequencing provided a compelling link. Despite this breakthrough, the investigation remained vulnerable to missteps. Any premature action risked disrupting the flow of information that investigators now depended on. The teams involved worked with heightened discretion, limiting the number of people informed of the potential prison connection. At the same time, the stakes increased. If the network sensed pressure, communication could shift to new channels, making further tracking difficult. As analysts built their case, one particular recording stood out. It contained a directive phrased in such a way that it mirrored an instruction discovered during a recent search of a suburban warehouse. The warehouse had held components consistent with the concealment methods used in previous shipments. When investigators compared the phrasing, the similarity was substantial enough to classify the recording as a critical piece of evidence. It was the closest they had come to identifying the individual behind the operation. Once this connection was established, the task force met to consider next steps. The possibility that a high-risk inmate was coordinating international drug movements required a significant shift in strategy. Investigators needed more than inferences. They needed material evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. The only way to obtain it was to continue tracing communications, review internal prison procedures, and secure judicial authorization for a targeted search. The decision was made to pursue a warrant. The process required detailed justification, outlining the parallels between external drug operations and the communications identified within Barwon. Senior officials reviewed the application carefully, aware of the implications of conducting a search within a maximum security facility. After thorough consideration, the request was approved. The approval marked a decisive break in the investigation. It was the moment when suspicion began to crystallize into actionable evidence. With the warrant authorized, the task force prepared to enter Barwon Prison, aiming to determine once and for all whether the source they had been seeking was the inmate whose name had surfaced repeatedly in their analysis. For the first time since the investigation began, the direction was clear. Whether the search would confirm their theory or expose a different truth altogether was yet to be seen. But the decision had been made, and the next step would bring the inquiry directly to the place where their strongest lead pointed. When the warrant to search Barwon Prison was authorized, the task force knew the operation had to be precise. Entering a maximum security facility was not a routine step, and every movement required coordination between correction staff and investigators. The search team gathered early, aware that they were stepping into an environment where even minor miscalculations could jeopardize months of work. Their objective was clear but narrow. Identify and collect any material that could confirm whether one inmate had been directing large-scale drug trafficking from behind the walls. The approach was quiet, measured, and without unnecessary disruption to other units within the facility. Upon entering the cell, officers expected to find little more than standard personal items. Prison procedures made it difficult for inmates to conceal anything substantial. Yet, as they began their systematic inspection, it became apparent that the room held more significance than anticipated. Hidden among everyday objects were small pieces of handwritten material. They were not overtly incriminating at first glance, but closer examination revealed patterns, coded references, partial sequences, and numbers that aligned with dates and identifiers used in the freight investigation. One sheet contained what appeared to be shipment markers, matching consignments flagged months earlier. Another included contact numbers written in fragmented form, designed to appear innocuous but immediately familiar to those tracking the financial component of the operation. The discovery of these notes marked the beginning of a broader evidentiary chain. Officers continued searching, uncovering documents that appeared to outline logistics, though written in a manner that required further decoding. The content was restrained, suggesting an understanding of how prison searches operated. Nothing explicit was recorded, yet each note, when placed alongside the others, helped shape an emerging picture. The cell did not contain a full operational blueprint, but it held enough fragments to suggest that the inmate had maintained far more involvement in external affairs than prison restrictions were intended to allow. Parallel to the physical search, financial investigators expanded their review of transactions involving individuals close to Marrogi. What began as routine analysis quickly revealed patterns inconsistent with ordinary household activity. Funds moved through accounts associated with family members, often in amounts that appeared small enough to avoid detection individually, but significant when aggregated. Transfers occurred at intervals that corresponded with key dates in the importation timeline. Manella's financial records displayed similar inconsistencies, showing deposits and withdrawals that aligned with known stages of the drug supply chain. None of these records alone proved criminal intent, but collectively they demonstrated a coordinated flow of money tied to the movement of the goods identified in earlier seizures. Investigators cross-referenced these financial irregularities with container documentation collected from freight terminals. Several shipments connected to the network displayed inconsistencies that mirrored the coded notes found in the cell. Dates, routing choices, and declared contents were not identical, but they followed patterns that matched the emerging operational structure. Surveillance footage from warehouses and storage lots added another layer of detail. Individuals linked to prior arrests were seen handling consignments that, when traced backward, aligned with financial movements within accounts connected to the Marrogi family and to Manella. Interviews with individuals previously detained during earlier raids also gained new significance. Statements that once seemed incomplete or contradictory now carried weight when placed in the broader context. Several detainees described receiving instructions through intermediaries who referenced an unnamed figure capable of overriding decisions and allocating responsibilities within the network. These descriptions aligned with the communication style identified in the prison recordings. Although none of the witnesses could provide the name directly, their accounts collectively signaled the presence of a central decision-maker whose methods had been structured to avoid direct exposure. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the scope of the operation began to come into focus. What had initially appeared to be a loosely organized network was now understood to be directed by someone with a clear grasp of hierarchy and logistics. The structure resembled not a casual or improvised enterprise, but a coordinated operation governed by strategy. The consistency across the freight, financial and communication evidence suggested that the person behind it had been approaching the venture with the mindset of a manager rather than an opportunist. This alignment led the task force to examine behavioral patterns noted during earlier stages of the inquiry. Analysts identified a leadership style that bore resemblance to organizational management. Delegation of tasks, compartmentalization of information, and reliance on trusted intermediaries. The orchestrator maintained distance while ensuring accountability. These traits reflected an understanding of how to operate within limitations, which became even more striking given the environment from which the instructions were believed to have originated. The person issuing these directives demonstrated a capacity to remain in control without appearing directly in any part of the physical chain. When investigators reviewed all the evidence collectively, the conclusion became unavoidable. The fragments found in the cell, the financial flows, the coded communications, and the witness descriptions all pointed to the same individual. The person directing the notorious crime family's operations was George Marrogi. Despite being imprisoned for murder, he had continued to influence and coordinate drug trafficking activities with a level of efficiency that surprised even experienced officers. The arrest that had been expected to end his involvement had instead shifted his method of operation into a form that relied heavily on organizational discipline and psychological leverage. The revelation sparked immediate concern among the agencies involved. The idea that an inmate within one of Victoria's most secure facilities had not only maintained but expanded a criminal network raised questions about the vulnerabilities within the correctional system. While there was no evidence of direct complicity from staff, the ability of an inmate to function in this capacity highlighted the inherent challenges in monitoring communication, enforcing restrictions, and preventing information from moving beyond prison walls. The discovery triggered internal reviews and raised questions about how many other operations might have been conducted using similar methods. Public reaction followed once the information became known through official channels. Media reports described the findings with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Communities already impacted by drug-related harm expressed anger that someone who had been convicted of taking a life was still able to contribute to further damage while incarcerated. Advocacy groups raised concerns about oversight and called for stronger safeguards to prevent similar situations in the future. The sense of public disappointment was not directed solely at the individual responsible, but at the broader system that had allowed the operation to persist undetected for so long. For the family of Kadir Ors, the news had a different impact. The case had already brought them considerable grief, and the realization that the man responsible for their loss had continued to engage in criminal conduct from within prison added another layer of distress. Their responses were measured, but those close to them described the renewed pain caused by the discovery. For them, the promise of closure had always been tied to the idea that imprisonment would end the harm. The emergence of this new information disrupted that expectation, extending the impact of the original incident further than they had anticipated. As investigators prepared their final reports, the full scale of the network became clearer. The operation had been shaped not by spontaneous decisions, but by consistent planning and intentional structure. The leadership relied on psychological tactics, financial management, and the capacity to maintain loyalty among participants rather than physical presence or intimidation. These characteristics stood in contrast to common depictions of criminal leadership and revealed a more complex form of control. The individual at the center of the operation had not needed access to the outside world beyond limited communication channels. His influence was driven by organization, clarity, and the ability to coordinate effectively under constraints. By the time the task force consolidated the findings, a sense of unease permeated the investigation. The evidence provided answers, but it also raised questions that extended beyond the case itself. The discovery that a maximum security cell had served as a functional command point blurred assumptions about the boundaries between containment and capability. It forced investigators to acknowledge that the systems designed to restrict harm were only as strong as the structures supporting them. When the final pages of the report were compiled, the conclusion was stark. The scale of the operation, combined with its origin, indicated that the situation was more complex than initially believed. The truth revealed through the investigation was blunt and deeply unsettling. The harm had not ended with incarceration. It had continued, expanded, and adapted. And as investigators reflected on the evidence laid before them, a single thought lingered, casting a shadow over the findings. The truth was worse than anyone had expected. The courtroom was already full when the hearing began, with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public gathered to witness the proceedings. The case had attracted considerable attention long before the trial itself, not only because of the scale of the drug operation, but because of the location from which it had been orchestrated. The notion that a maximum security inmate could oversee such an enterprise raised questions that went far beyond individual responsibility. It triggered concerns about the capacity of the state to contain high-risk offenders and highlighted systemic weaknesses that extended across multiple institutions. Inside the court, the atmosphere was measured. The judge presiding over the matter maintained a calm but attentive presence, aware that the case carried implications beyond the immediate charges. Rows of documents had been submitted by both the prosecution and the defense. These documents spanned financial records, telecommunication analyses, freight logs, and statements collected during earlier stages of the investigation. The volume of material required the court to move methodically, ensuring each piece of evidence was examined properly. The prosecution began by outlining the structure of the investigation. They presented the freight anomalies first, detailing the timing, routing, and concealment methods used across several shipments. Investigators had traced the origin of the goods from Malaysia and Thailand, emphasizing the consistency in how they entered the country. The prosecution then moved to financial evidence, describing how funds passed through accounts associated with family members and acquaintances. These flows coincided with the documentation surrounding each shipment, creating a chronology that demonstrated more than coincidence. Witness testimony added further detail. Officers involved in the freight investigation spoke about the challenges they encountered, including the difficulty of identifying anyone beyond low-level operatives. Their descriptions provided context for the scale of the operation. Surveillance analysts described the coded communication patterns. Corrections officers outlined the procedures for monitoring inmate calls and explained how certain conversations had come to attention during routine reviews. Each witness contributed a small part of the larger picture, allowing the court to understand how the operation had remained hidden for so long. The prosecution emphasized the leadership structure of the network. They argued that the organization did not operate on improvisation, but relied on coordinated actions linked to a single decision-maker. They drew attention to the way tasks had been delegated, how information had been compartmentalized, and how instructions had been issued in language designed to avoid detection. They also noted the alignment between the calls made from Barwon Prison and the timing of external events, including critical stages of container movement and distribution. When addressing Marrogi's alleged role, the prosecution took a restrained but firm approach. They stated that the evidence pointed to someone who had exercised control through strategy rather than direct presence. They cited notes found in the prison cell, financial discrepancies in accounts connected to family members, and the consistency of the coded instructions compared with actions taken by external participants. They reiterated that the network's efficiency demonstrated a level of coordination that could only have been maintained through ongoing leadership. The prosecution described this conduct as dangerous, deliberate, and incompatible with the constraints expected within a high-security environment. The defense, in contrast, focused on procedural concerns. They argued that the investigation relied too heavily on inference and interpretation. According to the defense, the notes found in the cell were ambiguous and did not explicitly reference criminal activity. They suggested that the financial transfers identified by investigators were familial rather than operational, and that the conclusions drawn from communication patterns were speculative. The defense stressed that recorded calls did not contain explicit instructions regarding drug importation, and that the coded nature of the conversations left room for alternative explanations. A central theme of the defense's argument was the claim that Marrogi had been treated unfairly by the system. They suggested that the scrutiny directed at him was influenced by his criminal history, rather than the strength of the evidence. They argued that the prison environment had created conditions where actions were misinterpreted, and that his attempts to maintain contact with family and acquaintances were viewed through an unnecessarily suspicious lens. The defense maintained that the corrections system had failed to provide adequate support for rehabilitation, implying that institutional failures had shaped the circumstances in which misunderstandings could arise. As the hearing progressed, cross-examination revealed the limitations and strengths of both sides. Investigators conceded that certain pieces of evidence, viewed individually, lacked explicit clarity. However, they maintained that the collective weight of the material built a consistent and compelling narrative. Defense counsel highlighted the absence of direct visual proof linking Marrogi to the organization of any shipment. In response, prosecutors argued that leadership in organized crime often relied on distance, and that the sophistication of the operation reflected intentional avoidance of physical involvement. Throughout the proceedings, the judge asked targeted questions. They sought clarification on timelines, communication links, and financial irregularities. The judge also requested additional explanation regarding the internal oversight processes within Barwon Prison, particularly the monitoring of high-risk inmates. This indicated an interest not only in determining guilt, but in understanding how the events had unfolded within a facility designed to prevent such conduct. Outside the courtroom, public reaction varied. Some viewed the case as a failure of the correction system. They expressed frustration that someone convicted of murder could continue to exert influence and participate in organized crime despite maximum security restrictions. Others questioned whether the system had provided adequate resources for managing inmates with complex behavioral profiles. Advocacy groups raised concerns about resourcing, prison overcrowding, and the limitations of surveillance technology. These broader conversations contributed to a growing sense of unease about the effectiveness of the state's response to serious offenders. When the prosecution completed its presentation of evidence, the court moved into closing submissions. The Crown emphasised the intelligence work that had uncovered the network, arguing that the evidence demonstrated sustained leadership and intentional coordination. They characterised the conduct as calculated and harmful, pointing to the societal impact of drug distribution and the risks associated with criminal networks operating across international borders. They stated that the sophistication of the operation required decisive legal response. The defence maintained that the evidence left too many gaps to support such a conclusion. They argued that proximity to individuals involved in drug trafficking did not equate to participation in the network. They reiterated that the codes used in calls could be interpreted in multiple ways and insisted that the prosecution had constructed a narrative based on assumption rather than certainty. They urged the court to consider the risk of misinterpretation and argued that the corrections environment had complicated the assessment of communication patterns. In delivering judgment, the judge returned to the core of the evidence. They acknowledged the defence's concerns regarding inference, but stated that when assessed collectively, the prosecution's material demonstrated a clear and coherent pattern. They noted that leadership in criminal organizations often operated through distance and delegation. They described the coded communication as reflective of intentional concealment rather than benign interaction. The judge concluded that the evidence established a level of involvement consistent with coordination and direction of the drug network. The sentencing remarks were measured but critical. The judge described the conduct as outrageous, noting that the use of a prison environment to direct criminal activity represented a severe abuse of the system's limitations. They emphasized the harm caused by drug trafficking and the difficulty it created for law enforcement attempting to intercept these operations. In recognition of the gravity of the conduct, the court imposed an additional 22 years imprisonment, ordering that this term be served cumulatively with the existing sentence. Following the sentencing, discussion extended beyond individual accountability. Policy analysts, criminologists, and legal experts began examining the systemic issues highlighted by the case. They questioned how an inmate in maximum security could access communication channels capable of sustaining such operations. Attention shifted to the broader challenges facing corrections: limited staffing, resource constraints, aging infrastructure, and the increasing complexity of managing high-risk inmates with extensive external networks. Concerns were also raised regarding the monitoring of financial transactions. Investigators noted that while suspicious activity reports existed, the fragmented nature of information sharing between agencies allowed gaps to persist. These gaps enabled criminal networks to move funds discreetly over extended periods. The case prompted calls for improved interagency collaboration, with a particular focus on linking corrections intelligence more effectively with federal financial monitoring bodies. Public response remained divided. Some saw the sentencing as overdue accountability, a necessary measure to protect the community from further harm. Others felt unsettled by the systemic vulnerabilities exposed during the trial. The case reignited debate about the role of incarceration in addressing organised crime. Critics argued that prisons alone could not disrupt networks capable of adapting to external restrictions. Supporters of reform emphasised the need to strengthen rehabilitation programming and improve surveillance technologies to reduce opportunities for manipulation. During this period, Marrogi initiated legal action against the state, claiming that the conditions of his confinement breached standards of humane treatment. He argued that prolonged restriction, limited access to outdoor space, and certain monitoring practices constituted excessive hardship. The claim added another layer of complexity to the public debate. Some viewed it as an attempt to challenge accountability, while others saw it as a reflection of broader concerns regarding the management of high-security inmates. The legal challenge did not retroactively alter the criminal findings, but it contributed to ongoing scrutiny of the correctional environment. As institutions continued to evaluate the ramifications of the case, questions persisted about the adequacy of existing safeguards. Officials acknowledged the difficulty of monitoring communications within maximum security units, especially as technology evolved. They also recognized that the decentralized nature of organized crime required a more coordinated response across state and federal levels. These reflections formed part of a larger inquiry into how criminal enterprises adapt to constraints and how the state can respond effectively. By the time discussions reached their height, the core issue had become impossible to ignore. The case had shown that one individual, operating from within a cell designed to restrict every aspect of daily life, had successfully exerted influence over a network that crossed borders and jurisdictions. The implications were far-reaching. It forced authorities to confront difficult truths about vulnerabilities within systems intended to uphold security and community safety. When the final assessments were made and the dust began to settle, one question continued to dominate public and institutional reflection. It was a question that extended beyond the specifics of the case and spoke to the broader challenges facing the justice system. If one person could build and maintain a criminal empire from inside a prison, where had the system failed? In the months following the final sentencing, the immediate noise surrounding the case began to settle, but the quiet that followed carried its own weight. What remained was a landscape altered in ways both visible and concealed. The criminal enterprise built under the direction of George Marrogi had been dismantled, yet the effects of its existence continued to move through communities across Victoria. These effects were not limited to the courtroom or the intelligence reports that had guided the investigation. They extended into homes, neighbourhoods and institutions that had absorbed the consequences long before the scale of the operation became known. For many families, the aftermath was measured not in legal outcomes, but in personal loss. Communities affected by drug distribution had spent years dealing with its impact. Some households had experienced repeated cycles of addiction. Others had faced the strain of supporting young people overwhelmed by the availability of substances circulating through local markets. The case brought these stories back into public conversation, highlighting the long-term harm caused by networks capable of operating quietly and consistently. While the criminal enterprise had been disrupted, the damage it left behind did not disappear with the arrest or conviction of its key figures. These families did not follow the case for its legal sophistication or investigative detail. They followed it because the consequences had entered their homes in tangible ways: strained relationships, financial pressure, health crises, and emotional fatigue. The trial forced them to confront a reality that had been present long before the story reached headlines. The connection between high-level criminal coordination and everyday suffering became clearer, even if the lines remained difficult to trace on an individual level. As the story moved further into the public sphere, These quieter forms of harm became part of the broader conversation, though they were rarely examined with the same intensity as the legal proceedings. Beyond community impact, the case exposed fractures within the correction system that demanded attention. Barwon Prison, long considered a cornerstone of maximum security containment in Victoria, faced intense scrutiny. The ability of an inmate to communicate with external networks raised questions that could not be ignored. Reviews identified gaps in monitoring practices, inconsistencies in telephone oversight, and limitations in the surveillance technologies used to detect coded communication. The challenge was not attributed to individual error, but to structural limitations. Staff working under resource constraints found it increasingly difficult to maintain oversight in an environment where criminal networks adapted faster than institutional systems could accommodate. These revelations led to calls for reform. Correctional authorities introduced stricter controls on phone access, improving both call monitoring procedures and the systems used to detect irregular communication patterns. In addition, risk assessment protocols for high-profile or high-risk inmates were revised. The objective was not only to restrict opportunities for criminal coordination, but to strengthen the protective measures for staff and other inmates who might be affected by such activity. While these changes offered improvements on paper, their effectiveness depended heavily on consistent enforcement, ongoing funding, and the development of new technologies capable of addressing evolving methods of communication. At the federal level, the case prompted a renewed emphasis on collaboration between the Australian Federal Police and international partners. The investigation had highlighted how dependent organised crime groups were on overseas supply chains. As a result, agencies across Southeast Asia and Europe strengthened information sharing arrangements, focusing on early detection and disruption of illicit shipments before they reached Australian ports. Intelligence analysts worked to refine algorithms that flagged unusual freight patterns, aiming to prevent similar operations from developing unnoticed in the future. These initiatives represented a recognition that large-scale importation networks required responses extending beyond domestic borders. Even with the structural changes underway, the public response remained mixed. Some viewed the reforms as overdue, questioning how such vulnerabilities had existed for so long. Others were cautious, noting that criminal networks had historically shown an ability to adapt quickly when confronted with new barriers. This uncertainty was reflected in social commentary, where discussions moved beyond the specifics of the case and into broader questions about the purpose and limitations of incarceration. Critics argued that prisons created environments where certain forms of leadership could thrive, especially when external networks relied on an inmate's reputation rather than physical mobility. Supporters of the reforms insisted that stronger technology and oversight could significantly reduce these risks. The divided public reaction revealed a deeper tension within the justice system. While sentencing emphasized accountability, it did not resolve the underlying issues that allowed the criminal enterprise to develop. The case became a reference point in debates about the future of corrections in Victoria. Policymakers considered whether maximum security units required additional investment not only in surveillance, but also in staff development, mental health support, and rehabilitative programming. Others argued that the system needed to differentiate more effectively between inmates capable of influencing large networks and those who posed less structural risk. This discussion continued long after the court's decision, shaped by differing philosophies on punishment, prevention, and rehabilitation. Among law enforcement personnel, the case served as a reminder of the complexity of organised crime. The network operated through layers that shielded its leadership, allowing it to function even under restrictive circumstances. The ability of the operation to adapt and conceal itself demonstrated the need for investigative approaches that combined traditional policing with advanced intelligence analysis. For those who had worked on the case, the outcome brought a measure of closure, But it also raised questions about the networks that might still exist undetected. The concern was not hypothetical. Officers acknowledged that other groups could be using similar structures, relying on distance, coded communication, and international supply chains to operate beneath the surface. This uncertainty extended into the community. People who had followed the case asked whether Barwon was unique or whether similar forms of control existed in other facilities. The lack of publicly available information about ongoing investigations contributed to speculation. Community groups and advocacy organisations called for greater transparency in how high-risk inmates were monitored, while also expressing concern about balancing security with humane treatment. These competing expectations placed pressure on the system to address public concerns without compromising the privacy or safety of those within the corrections environment. Inside the prison system, changes were implemented gradually. Restrictions on phone use tightened. Staff received additional training on identifying coded language. Technologies designed to detect unauthorized communication devices were updated. While these measures reduced certain risks, they also highlighted the constant tension between containment and control. High-security inmates were often isolated for extended periods, raising concerns about mental health and long-term behavioral effects. Reform advocates argued that without adequate support structures, such environments could foster desperation or heightened attempts to circumvent restrictions. Despite ongoing improvements, the legacy of the case extended beyond procedural adjustments. It forced a broader reassessment of how criminal networks interacted with the justice system. Analysts began examining patterns in other investigations, looking for similarities that might indicate attempts to coordinate operations from within correctional facilities. This work was ongoing, shaped by the understanding that organised crime operated through adaptation and resilience. The challenge for law enforcement was to remain equally adaptable. For communities affected by the network's activities, the repercussions remained deeply personal. Families dealing with the consequences of drug-related harm often expressed a subdued form of frustration. They acknowledged the significance of the conviction, but recognised that the damage done in their communities would take far longer to repair. Support services noted increased demand as individuals sought assistance for issues linked to drug use, financial stress, or family instability. These challenges, though not directly caused by the criminal enterprise, were intensified by its presence. The criminal group associated with the notorious crime family did not disappear entirely after the sentencing. Some members had been arrested. Others distanced themselves from the network. A few individuals remained involved in smaller-scale activities, though without the same coordination or influence. Law enforcement continued to monitor these remnants, aware that fragmented groups could either dissolve or reorganize depending on external pressures. The uncertainty surrounding their future contributed to ongoing vigilance across several agencies. As months turned into years, the case continued to serve as a reference point in discussions about organised crime, corrections oversight, and community resilience. Its impact persisted not through dramatic events, but through quieter, ongoing shifts in policy, practice, and public perception. Universities incorporated the case into criminal justice courses. Professional training programs for corrections staff used it as a study in operational risk. Media coverage revisited the case when discussing new legislation or high-profile incidents. Its influence became part of the institutional memory of the justice system. Yet, despite all the analysis, reforms and discussion, one question remained at the centre of public consciousness. It was a question that touched not only on the specifics of the operation, but on the broader vulnerabilities of the system. People wondered how many similar networks might be operating in silence, concealed within the gaps that investigators had yet to uncover. They questioned whether the case represented an exception, or whether it revealed a pattern that had not yet been fully recognized. The uncertainty created a lingering sense of unease, one that could not be resolved through sentencing alone. In quiet moments, away from the headlines and formal reviews, the case left behind a deeper form of reflection. It forced communities, institutions, and individuals to confront the reality that harm did not always appear in dramatic form. Sometimes it developed slowly, through overlooked conversations, fragmented financial transfers, and shipments that moved unnoticed through freight terminals. The story showed that the absence of noise did not equate to the absence of danger. It revealed how silence, when left unexamined, could become the space in which criminal networks operated most effectively. And so the final legacy of the case was not a single event or policy change, but a lingering reminder of the risks that emerge when systems fail to detect what unfolds quietly beneath them. Sometimes harm grows not from what is seen, but from what goes unchallenged. Sometimes the most dangerous operations are those conducted in stillness. And in the end, one truth remained, echoing through every layer of the investigation and every conversation that followed its conclusion. Sometimes evil does not need a scream. It only needs a silence held for far too long,